Okay, so the first talk, Stephen Wright, Rumour and Reasons for Belief.
Okay, thank you very much all of you for coming, and thank you all very much for having me. This is a talk, first and foremost, about the epistemology of testimony. And whenever you give a talk about the epistemology of testimony, as many of you will know, you have to begin with a slide that looks like this. One that tells you that, look, lots of what we know, we seem to know because of what people tell us somehow. Testimony is just the word of other people, whether it's spoken or written or overheard or presented to us in some other form. Road signs are forms of testimony. Newspapers are forms of testimony. Ordinary conversations are forms of testimony. And it's important to be clear in these cases exactly how much of our knowledge that testimony accounts for, because this is why it's philosophically important. So I think I know, for instance, that the Battle of Hastings happened in 1066, but I can't remember it and I didn't see it or anything like that. It's because of testimony that I have some sort of access to this fact, and that helium has the atomic number 2. Again, I've never actually managed to look at it particularly and see that sort of thing. But nonetheless, I don't take it that the fact that I haven't seen it somehow makes my access to it less good. It seems like I've got a perfectly good way of knowing about these sorts of things. So when we start off with thinking about the epistemology of testimony, we normally start with a slide like this. But since we're in a bit of a rush, I won't do any of that stuff. What we'll talk about instead is internalism about testimony of a sort. So internalist theories, like all theories of testimony, are driven by the idea that we want to explain how it is that we come to find things out by believing what people say. How it is that believing people sometimes gets us to know things or form justified beliefs, and clearly in other cases it doesn't. We don't just know things every time we believe someone. So internalists, as I think about them here, make a kind of claim about what it is that supports people's beliefs when they believe things on the basis of testimony. The idea is that, according to internalists, a listener's justification for her belief in what someone says is just a matter of the reflectively accessible reasons that she uses in forming that belief. Importantly, these are reasons that she has to use in forming it, not just reasons that are sort of floating in the background. They need to be connected to the belief. So if Nick tells me something, and I have loads of good reasons for thinking Nick's knowledgeable about his subject, but I just sort of ignore them and take it on blind faith, those aren't reasons that I'm using here. Those reasons appear to be kind of detached from my belief somehow. This kind of way of looking at testimony involves suggesting that when we form justified beliefs, we treat each other in particular ways. We don't, as it were, just rely on each other. The idea is testimony allows a listener to expand their own knowledge base. The idea is a speaker says something, and then the listener takes that input and then works their way through some sort of reasoning process, starting with the speaker said this and ending with this is true. And that might go a number of ways. It might be that this person generally says true things, or that sounds like a highly plausible thing, or that people everywhere say true things, depending on what sorts of reasons you might think a listener has available to them. It might be that it goes different ways for different people on different occasions, and so on and so forth. But the basic idea is it starts with speaker said this and ends with it's true. This has a kind of interesting consequence for theories of testimony. It's connected to internalist theories in general, and a thing called the new evil demon argument. So the new evil demon argument considers it's not about testimony, at least in its first instance. The idea is that here's me standing in a room, seeing things in good lighting with reasonably working visual faculties and so on. Everything, epistemically speaking, appears to be going well for me. Whereas, on the other hand, a counterpart of me is actually a brain in a vat that thinks it's seeing things in a room with good working facilities and so on, but it's not. It's just hallucinating all over the place. Nonetheless, I can't tell the difference between my experiences and the vat's experiences, and the brain in the vat can't tell the difference between its experiences and mine. Where it seems objectively everything's going right for me and badly-ish for the brain. I mean, most things are going badly for the brain, not all of it. Maybe it'll form some true beliefs, but the perceptual ones at any rate are going to be unreliably produced. So say internalists, well, because what they have reflective access to, everything seems the same to these. The idea is that there's no difference here between my beliefs and the brain's beliefs in terms of justification. There's differences in all kinds of other things. A lot of the brain's beliefs are false, for one thing. But the idea is that with respect to justification, they're one and the same. We both have access to the same stuff. We can both bring to bear the same things in support of our beliefs. You might think there are various versions of internalism that don't think this, incidentally, that deny the results of the new evil demon argument. And I had a lengthy-ish conversation with Duncan about this in my Viva when he accused me of kind of cheating. And using internalism to mean things that, well, it's clearly a very narrow sense of internalism that it means. And I think that's probably right. But there are some people that think this, and there are some people that think this about testimony, more interestingly. So Friedrich Schmidt has a case where his kind of testimonial version of the new evil demon argument starts with a doctor who performs a thorough test on you and tells you you have this condition at the end, and then someone else who sort of looks like a doctor and looks like they're performing a thorough test, but they're not, and they tell you you have this condition at the end of it. And says Schmidt, well, look, intuitively, in the kind of canonical sense of justification, the doctor telling you and the non-doctor, assuming you can't tell them apart and you can bring to bear all the same things in each case, you're alike with respect to justification. So the idea is that we form beliefs, and these beliefs are justified by, say, inductive evidence of what people say being true, or evidence that the person in question is likely to be saying something true. That's the kind of internalist story about testimony. It's worth having that in view as we kind of make our way through some of this stuff. So rumour and gossip are particular forms of testimony. This is Cody talking about rumour and gossip. I don't really have a tight definition of what rumour is and what gossip is and the difference between the two. I'm going to take it that we all have at least some sort of implicit idea about the kinds of things that count as rumour and the kinds of things that count as gossip, but Cody distinguishes them in a way that I will here. He says that gossip and rumour are often run together in social science treatments, but they're basically different in kind. At any rate, he says, I shall treat them as differing in the way suggested at the outset, namely with respect to the justificatory base of the information conveyed. Gossip may be true and known, or justifiably believed to be so. Rumour has, by Cody's definition, no strong justificatory base. So where we're talking about gossip and rumour here, and the difference between the two, we'll be thinking of gossip as something that might, and in the case I'll be thinking of, does, have something to be said for it in terms of its justificatory base. Rumour is something that doesn't. And the idea is I'll take rumour and gossip and apply those to a particular kind of case that I've been thinking about before and suggest that this might have interesting consequences for internalist theories of testimony, namely that they're wrong. But here's a kind of anchor case to detach ourselves from rumour and gossip. So imagine, I call this a case of circular testimony, and it'll kind of become apparent why, I guess. Imagine Agatha, an ordinary person, looks across the street from her house and sees that the building opposite, which she recognises as Jesus College, is on fire. Agatha only has a quick glance, but nonetheless telephones her friend Francesca to tell her the news. Francesca unhesitatingly believes her friend and then tells her friend Anna, though since Anna doesn't know the college, Francesca describes the building and its location to Anna, who tells this information to Stacey. Stacey recognises the description of the building and it being Jesus College and telephones Agatha to tell her that Jesus College is on fire. I call this circular testimony because the idea is effectively that some testimony gets kind of passed around in a circle and ends up back with the person who started it, of a sort. So there are a few things to kind of think about in these kinds of cases. The important points about this, I suggest, are these, very roughly. The listeners other than Agatha in each of these cases, so all of the people who are not the person at the start and finish of the testimony chain, unhesitatingly believe what they're told. They don't behave like good internalists and think, well, this person told me this and I guess that sounds kind of plausible and they wouldn't really lie to me or something like that. None of that goes on. They just believe people. They hear it, they believe it in sort of one move. No inferential processing going on here. Agatha, final link in that chain, does, let's say, respond as a good internalist by believing Stacey. Suppose she knows Stacey. She's seen Stacey say true things before, reasons that Stacey's sort of fairly sensible, and constructs her own internalist-style argument to support her belief that Jesus College is on fire because Stacey said so. And it's also important that Agatha's not aware that there's kind of circularity going on here. From her perspective on things, she just sees something, later gets told it by someone else, and that's all she sees of this story. Unbeknownst to her, the thing's getting passed around in circles. So moving onwards for a moment. Here's the sort of general shape of the argument. Premise one, Agatha's justification isn't enhanced after she hears Stacey's testimony. The idea is that she is, epistemically speaking, no better at the end than she is at the start. Premise two, internalist theories say it is. Premise that, therefore, internalist theories go wrong. It's a modus tollens argument of a sort. Internalists have this consequence. Consequence is false, therefore internalism is false. Structurally, it's fairly straightforward. I mean, it is important, I think, premise one, to kind of remember that I was saying that Agatha's justification does come from her believing things, as an internalist would say, do. So she now has kind of two possibly complementary, I guess, streams of reasoning here. This is premise two, rather. The idea is that, well, she's got whatever justification perception provides her with in these kinds of cases, and she's got inductive evidence which looks like it's independent. Her observations about Stacey are independent of her observations about colleges being on fire, and so on. So the idea is that internalist theories ought to think that there's something better going on here because she's got more reason, she's got more things she can bring to bear in support of her argument. After all, if she found out that she'd been on, say, the painkillers or something like that, and they were going to make her perception go funny, that on the face of it wouldn't, from her perspective, undermine her argument for thinking, but Stacey said it too, or something like that. And nonetheless, I kind of think this is, importantly, the wrong thing to think. Here's something else to have a think about for a moment. Consider a case of straightforward rumour. David is aware of a job opening in his department, but he has nothing to do with the selection process. He's just aware that there's a job and that some people have applied. He knows that X has applied, and because he's a small-minded and mean little man, he guesses that X probably won't get the job. He tells his friend, in the style of rumour-mongering, Joe, that X won't get the job. And Joe, in turn, tells this to Al, who later, again, unbeknownst to David about the circularity, tells David that X won't get the job. This much is supposed to be a straightforward instance of rumour, more or less. Someone has no justificatory base for this. I mean, he's outside of the selection process. He knows not what's going on these kinds of things. Assume that's fairly straightforward. He's just saying this because he's mean and shallow and small-minded and dislikes people. So here's the basic idea behind this kind of case. David has no justification for his belief that X won't get the job, even after he hears it afterwards from Al. Again, remembering it's important that each of the listeners in this case that aren't that first and last person, the person at the start and finish of the circle, believe unhesitatingly. I think this intuition subsides quite fast, incidentally, if these people do some cognitive processing or something like that, and various people think about it and think, well, yeah, that sounds kind of plausible to me. I think it's sensible in that case to say that justification might go up in virtue of it being passed through a lot of people that are thinking about it. But these are unhesitating, unthinking people. These are analogous to the kind of circular case, the circle case that I described with Agatha and the college. And if it's right to say that, well, David has no justification even after he hears it in the testimony case, it seems right to think that, since by stipulation David, we can say, has some sorts of reasons for thinking that Al generally says true things, it looks like internalist reasons, those kinds of things, don't generate justification from scratch. If he had none at the beginning, he has none at the end, well, he now has some internalist testimony-style reasons. But nonetheless, they don't get his belief off the ground. This is connected to what John McFarlane calls knowledge laundering. The idea is you can take a belief that's not knowledge, pass it through a bunch of people and get knowledge out at the end, or justified belief out at the end, something like that. And this, on the face of it, seems wrong. McFarlane thinks this is a problem for externalist transmission theories, incidentally. I'm not sure it is, and I've tried to suggest sort of elsewhere that this isn't a problem. It comes from abusing kind of shifting standards for knowledge, in McFarlane's case. But the core intuition here is one and the same. You can't take a belief you don't know, tell it to a bunch of people, get it back again, in the same way that you can't come to get justified belief by saying something, thinking, oh, actually, I usually say true things. And that gives me an argument to the conclusion that what I'm saying is true. That's no good, and the idea here is that, unbeknownst to the speakers, this is just the same thing going on here. You can't learn from your own testimony. Wittgenstein points out that you don't get additional justification by reading 2 copies of the morning's paper, or something like that. The idea is they're not appropriately independent of each other. And the thought is something similar here. It's a failure of independence that goes on in these kinds of cases. And the failure of independence means that if you have no justification at the beginning, you have no justification at the end, more or less. So I suggest. Think about a different kind of case, a slightly less small-minded person. Verity's on the search committee for a job. Having seen the interviews, so plausibly with some justification, we might say in these cases, she thinks that X won't get the job. She tells this to Mia, who tells it to Sarah, who in turn tells it to Verity. Another case, again, with all the same features. I haven't written them into the details of this case, but unhesitating listeners, apart from the first and last one, a reflecting internalist-style listener at the start and finish of the circle, and an initial speaker who's unaware of what's being passed around, of the fact that the testimony is circular here. She just says it to someone later, hears it from someone else. Fair enough. In this case, though, plausibly we do have an instance of justification. But even though there's justification kind of in the chain at the start, if you like, that Verity has plausibly some reason, having seen the interviews, for thinking, oh, that person's interview was terrible, they're not getting this job. I'm not entirely convinced that this makes any difference to anything. It seems to me like Verity has no justification for her belief that X won't get the job at the end, other than that which she had at the beginning. She plausibly still has that, but the idea is that the fact that she's passed it round through unhesitating, unreflecting listeners means that there's no kind of increase in justification. It's not just the case that we, unlike the Rumour case where we started with nothing and finished with nothing, in this case we start with something and finish with something, just no more of it, of a sort. So the idea is that internalist reasons here don't, by themselves, enhance pre-existing justification. The Rumour case was supposed to try and show that they don't generate justification where there was none in the first place. This case is trying to show that even where there is justification in the first place, it doesn't go up in cases of just passing things around, even though you have more internalist reasons to bring to bear on the subject. So that's kind of the basic idea of the argument here, and there's a few other things to try and say here by way of sort of preempting responses of a sort. I mean, you might think that, particularly with the first kind of case, the case where the original circle kind of anchoring case that I was using to bring out the details of these things, you might think that, look, well, what goes on in this kind of case is that Agatha sees something, and it's a basic fact about whatever we want to say about perception and whatever we want to say about testimony. Perception just swamps testimony, epistemically. Better to see things for yourself than to get it from other people. Epistemologists of testimony probably won't like this very much because they think testimony is very important. So they won't like it being pushed subordinate to perception. But nonetheless, this is a thing we might say to sort out the situation here. We might say, well, okay, so Agatha has some more reasons, but that's because there's just a sort of basic principle covering these things that says, look, if you've seen something, then any testimony you get on this is just adding nothing overall to these sorts of things. Testimony can get you to know things that you couldn't see, like my Battle of Hastings or helium facts. Can't see them at all, hence I get justification from testimony. But the idea in this kind of case is that we might say, well, okay, but when you've already seen something, someone else telling you about it doesn't help you at all. But this, I suspect, is false. And that's the reason that I don't think this is a particularly good way of trying to swap back this case. I mean, suppose, for instance, for one thing, it won't cover the case of either rumour or gossip, where the justificatory base is more flimsy. Neither of those cases appealed to perception in those cases. One case had no justification in it at all. But nonetheless, we might think, suppose Stacey had independently seen the college on fire and then told Agatha. So now she's seen it herself. She's not just depending on unhesitating people telling her or something like that. We might think in this kind of case, well, it seems like independent testimony can enhance overall justification. If loads of us have seen it and tell something, if loads of us have seen an event happen and tell that to someone, that is a sense in which it's better than just one of us telling them that. The point here is what seems to matter is independence of a sort. In a case where someone who doesn't depend on these things, on the original source, tells Agatha, someone whose reason for believing isn't just ultimately that Agatha said so, those kinds of cases do offer us an increase in justification. And this gets us to the real problem, I think, for internalist theories. It seems intuitively, at least to me, like in one case there's no overall increase in justification. In the other case, there is an overall increase in justification, at least potentially one. But the reason for this is nothing that internalist theories have as part of their repertoire, at least not internalist theories that want to make those kinds of claims about the new evil demon cases. Cases that say, well, it all kind of looks the same to you, or you've got the same reasons available to you, therefore your justification's the same in these cases. The idea is that the problem here is the independence, or non-independence, as the case may be, is entirely opaque to the subject in both of these cases. And this is designed to draw the intuition that Well, things that you're not aware of can make quite a difference to you, at least in testimony cases, and at least in cases where things can go circular-wise. So the real challenge is how to say, in a case where they're independent, you can get extra justification. In a case where they're circular independent, you can't. Easy if you're an externalist, you just jump straight to the objective facts and point at that fact and say, well, this is the reason, or something like that. Harder if you're an internalist, because you don't think that these objective facts matter to you, at least not in the same way. Okay, here's a second kind of objection that you might worry about. I mean, you might wonder, for one thing, whether all this hasn't been done before. It's certainly a very common strategy. Gibbons makes this kind of line and says, look, if you want to reject internalism, here's what you do. You tell some stories. You find two people, claim they're the same on the inside, not the same on the outside, not the same epistemically. Done, internalism is false. And it's certainly true that a lot of people have tried to do this kind of thing before, debatably successfully in various cases. And this is probably also debatably successfully. But nonetheless, you might worry that what this is really peddling and what this depends on in the circular case is some kind of skepticism about induction, and that's really bad. We don't want to be induction skeptics. We want to allow that induction is a way of getting to know things. The idea is that, well, I said in the case of Agatha believing Stacey's testimony, she has inductive evidence of Stacey's reliability or something like that, and it sounds like what I'm suggesting is that, but this is inductive evidence is no good. On the face of it, I don't think that's anything that this kind of argument relies on. Jennifer Lackey makes an argument against internalist theories, although reductionist theories in her hands, as she calls them, which appeals to the idea of someone you know and have good reasons for believing telling you that someone else knows a lot about animals, and then the person tells you about animals and you use all your reasons and come to figure out the truth of what they're saying. But nonetheless, says Lackey, if they're an unreliable speaker, you don't get justification out of this. It's intuitive that you can't know things by believing unreliable testimony, regardless of what reasons you have for thinking it's reliable. If reasons themselves don't put you in touch with reliable testimony, well then, hard to see what value they're doing in these kinds of things, says Lackey. That, I think, might lead to induction skepticism of a sort. If you think that reasons are only good kind of instrumentally speaking and have a kind of instrumental value to them, which is to find reliable people and instruments and so on, and that's what they're for, then you probably are dubious of the idea that induction's any good in and of itself. But the kind of argument I was giving here doesn't suggest that induction's no good in and of itself. Indeed, I'm suggesting that at least sometimes induction can be very good. The kind of case where they were independent, I would suggest that, well, in those sorts of cases, you can get more justification by induction. Agatha's inductive evidence seems to be good there, in a case where they're independent. She can use all her inductive evidence, and the fact that she has this kind of inductive evidence is exactly what justifies her belief. The inductive evidence seems to count there, although the reason it seems to count is one that's beyond her internal grip on things. So indeed, you might think that making the kind of two-part problem here of how to distinguish between these cases that I'm after is one that actually relies on induction, skepticism being false. I think at least sometimes induction is good, just not in cases where testimony is circular and it's putting you in contact with someone who only says what they say because you said it in the first place. So here's one final kind of line of objection. You might wonder whether this is really about justification at all, or what reasons we have for suggesting that this is about justification at all. I mean, what you might think is that, well, there are clearly some cases in which... Step back for a moment. I mean, think about the doctor case for the moment. The case of the doctor who performs a genuine and rigorous test and then tells you have a condition, and the doctor who performs a made-up and unreliable test and then tells you have a condition. On the face of it, in those cases, we might say, well, in that kind of case, clearly they're alike in some sorts of respects. They're alike with respect to reasons. They're not alike in other sorts of respects. How is it that we pin the label justification on the sense in which they're not alike, as the objection to internalism goes, or in the sense that they are alike, as the internalist would have it? That we might think is hard, and it's something that we had sort of lengthy discussions about because it appeared in my thesis. And Duncan was slightly suspicious that I might be cheating and sliding things around by using different terms to pick out different things. So I moved between talking about epistemic properties and justification in different places. And I think the move was benign, and I think it's fairly innocuous, but rather than try and defend that here, I figured I'd try and offer a case that can wriggle out of it somehow, more or less. The kind of trip here is, I think, okay, this isn't, as I see it, obviously a case in which there are some senses in which a listener's better off and some senses in which they're not. In the case of circular testimony, pick your favourite example of the circular thing, I'm struggling to see how it is that they are in any sense better off. Think about the first one. Go with Agatha, the easiest one to perhaps think about, the most described of them. I mean, one thing you might think is that Agatha's in a position to sort of know stuff better than she was in the first place, but that doesn't seem entirely clear to me at all. It's not clear to me that these reasons get her, as it were, a better understanding of what's going on. If they do get us any kind of better understanding of what's going on, it sounds to me suspiciously like knowledge laundering of a sort. The idea that you can just pass things around and get more understanding out at the end. The idea is that any sense in which people are different, they don't know anything that they used to know, they don't know anything better, they're not better informed in any particular way. They just think they are, in some interesting sense. So while there's pressure on this kind of idea to say, well, it needs to be justification, the sense in which Edith aims with, I'm inclined to think in these kinds of cases that there just isn't any interesting sense in which Agatha or David or Verity are better off at the end than they were at the beginning. And insofar as there is a sense in which they're not the same, I can't see any epistemic interest in that kind of thing. They have in no sense pursued their epistemic goals better, at least as far as I can tell, and those sorts of things. So rather than having interesting senses in which they're the same and interesting senses in which they're different and trying to pin different properties onto one rather than the other, which is going to be hard to do without begging the question, I guess, saying, no, justification should be this rather than this. In this kind of situation, I find it hard to see how there's any interesting sense in which they're epistemically different at all at the end as compared to the beginning. And with that in mind, I'd leave things there.